as well. And obviously we welcome people who are not members of the NUJ along to this event this evening. So first of all, I'm going to ask Natasha Hurst, who is actually one of our members who's on the National Executive Committee of the NUJ, to say some words about our branch and also about the NUJ Training Wales organisation. And after that, I shall introduce our very distinguished guest speaker this evening. And I know that we're all anxious to hear what he has to say. But first of all, Natasha, if I ask you to do a little introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And also, just before I start, just to let people know who've arrived in the room, that we are recording this webinar, this presentation. So if there are people in the room who wouldn't like to be seen on camera at any point during the recording, then please do turn the cameras off. And then later, also when we put questions to Shirish, you can put the questions in the chat box. I can read them out for you, or if you would like to, then you can read the questions out yourself. And as usual, we ask everybody to stay on mute when others are speaking. But following all that Zoom etiquette, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today. It's certainly an event that we've been really looking forward to. So it's the Cardiff and South East Wales branch of the National Union of Journalists that has organised this event in partnership with NUJ Training Wales. Some of you may already be aware of NUJ Training Wales. It's a Wales Union Learning funded project that provides skills training and professional development opportunities for members across the creative industries. You don't have to be a union member to be able to access the courses, but you get a discount if you are. And there are some absolutely brilliant skills development and training opportunities there. Our Cardiff branch of the NUJ is very active. We've got lots of members who work across very different sectors of the industry. We have a number of freelancers. We have people who work in broadcasting, TV, magazines, across a whole variety of different roles. So it's you know, really fantastic to see so many people interested in this event. And please do take a look on the link that Andrew has put in the chat box to find out a little bit more about the union. But I don't want to take up any more time because we've all been looking forward to Shirish's presentation. And I know there's going to be a lot of food for thought in there as well. So I'll hand over to Martin to introduce Shirish properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Natasha. Yes, well, the union isn't simply concerned with members' pay and conditions. In recent years, for quite a few years now, actually, we've also been thinking quite deeply about the future of journalism, both in terms of its commercial viability, but also the kind of ethical questions that come up as well. And in Shirish, we have someone who is a very distinguished investigative journalist. He has done a lot of very, very good work on issues like the radicalisation of children by the far right, on things like the overprescription of antidepressants and ADHD drugs to young people. And he also uncovered the British Steel pension scandal, which led to a parliamentary inquiry and ultimately to a ban on pensions cold calling. So he's got a lot of very good experience under his belt, and obviously he is a major exponent of public interest journalism. Now, like many of us, I guess, Shirish has also been thinking very strongly and very deeply about the future of journalism, about the kind of ethical issues that crop up, and also about how journalism really, I guess, needs to change in order to take account of the increasing diversity of our society and the need for greater representation from diverse communities, and so that journalism isn't apart from the mainstream of our life, but is embedded in communities. Now, the talk that Shirish is going to give us is essentially about what and who journalism is for, and it's constructing a model of reflective journalism that better reflects our communities. So without any further ado, I welcome Shirish to this meeting and ask him to give us his presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And as a Welsh journalist, it's really lovely to be able to speak at an event organised by NUJ Cardiff and NUJ Training Wales. Although I know, of course, we have an audience from across the UK. And thank you mainly for calling me an expert in the publicity for this. I don't really believe it, but it's nice to think I might finally have figured out what it is I'm doing around here. So I had this talk all planned and written, and then, frankly, the last couple of days happened. So some of you may have heard about a little interview on US television over the weekend, where the issue of racism was mentioned in passing. And then, as you may have seen, perhaps more interestingly to me, the Society of Editors decided to weigh in yesterday to claim that the British media isn't racist and everything's absolutely fine. And in fact, we're doing a bang up job. So I have some thoughts on that, none of which would be fit to print in any of the Society of Editors members publications, I don't think. So I'll come to some of those thoughts over the next hour or so. But it's actually been, frankly, a really difficult day for me because I've worked with the Society of Editors on panels and other stuff. And what Ian Murray from the Society of Editors probably has no understanding of is that when he comes up with his misguided rants, journalists of colour like me have to respond. We can't sit back and let it play out. We have to call it out, burn bridges in some cases, cut off potential sources of income, because he's essentially delegitimizing everything we do, everything we experience, and undermining all the work we and many others are doing to make things better. So ironically, the most recent work I did for the Society of Editors was a panel on mental health in newsrooms. And thanks, Ian, this has not been a good day for my mental health, but I'm really glad to be here now to think positively about how we can work to make the change that we so obviously need. So that leads me on to what I'm going to be talking about today, what I call the 7 building blocks of reflective journalism. And I like to think of the 7 building blocks as a toolkit, really, certainly not rules, because I definitely don't believe in rules in journalism. In fact, I think they're a big part of the problems with our current conception of journalism that I'm going to talk about in the presentation. And why reflective journalism? 2 reasons, really. Firstly, we need to make sure that we reflect as journalists on what we think the purpose of journalism is. Generally, that's why we became journalists in the first place, and whether we're actually meeting that purpose in our day-to-day work. And secondly, as I've just mentioned, it's absolutely imperative that we better reflect the world in which our journalism exists. And a huge part of that is remembering that journalism is a service. It's not for other journalists, it's for citizens. And we have to have citizens in our mind at every point of what we do. And my experience over 25 years has been actually people are thinking more often of their competitors. Like in my TV career, it was, oh, we'll do this graphic because News at 10 on the BBC won't be able to do that. Not thinking about whether that's actually helping people understand the story, for example. So I hope you'll indulge me a bit too, because I'm going to be talking about storytelling in this session, one of my big passions. And I'm going to weave some of my own story into this, not because I think I'm anything special, because I certainly don't, but because I think the story of my career is actually a fairly good example of the way journalism hasn't reflected the world we live in, and how journalism can easily become detached from the real world. So my background is largely as a TV news journalist. So over the last 25 years, I've worked in every major broadcast newsroom in the UK and done almost every job there is to do, from directing vision mixing bulletins to being a cameraman editor on the road, to editing network news programs, and frankly, everything between and beyond. So over the last 7 years, since I moved home to Wales, I've worked as a freelancer, mostly focusing on investigations, as Martin described. Yeah, and I think the thing that I'm probably best known for in Wales particularly is the British Steel pension scandal. And on top of the things that Martin described, the thing that's kind of most important to me is that it resulted in many millions of pounds being paid out in compensation to steel workers who had been, yeah, frankly, done over by charlatans. For the last 18 months or so, though, I've also been researching news storytelling as part of the Creative Clusters programme here in South Wales Cluster. And I also work at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism as a community organiser, actually, not as a journalist, which is an important distinction, in the Bureau local team there, which is focused, as Martin described, on telling stories with and for communities, not just about them in a kind of top-down way. So hopefully all of that has given me a pretty thorough understanding of how journalism and the way it works. But if I'm honest, none of that should really have happened. As you know, Indian culture has historically been centuries ahead of Western culture in many ways. And so in India, journalism has been a low status career for a very long time. And the haters in kind of Western society are only really just catching up with that. But frankly, it was never really a priority career option for me or my sister, who Martin knows, and we're actually both journalists now. So what that meant was the sort of norms, habits, and culture of journalism weren't really part of my life as I was growing up. So an example which may well shock lots of you, and I'm perfectly happy to be really honest about this, I was 20 years old, studying politics at Oxford University, before I realised that newspapers have their own distinct political agendas. Like, it just wasn't a thing that I was aware of, because my hinterland is totally different from most journalists. So unlike a surprisingly large number of my peers at university and in my first few jobs, my parents weren't famous journalists, and they didn't own a publication or a TV production company. For those people, buying a paper was sometimes literally buying the publication, not just cycling to the newsagent, which is what I was doing. And I mentioned that right at the start, because in this industry, I think we can tend to be very focused on our own conception within the industry of what journalism is, and a kind of very deep understanding, naturally, of the way it works, because so many people in this industry have come from such similar backgrounds. But it's important to know that that conception is largely not one that's shared or understood in the same way at all by the citizens we are here to serve, right? So in my case, and I have many journalists and aspiring journalists who come from, I guess, non-traditional backgrounds, it's also not an understanding we share. And in fact, we kind of largely reject that understanding, because too often, frankly, it rejects and excludes us. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly so we can hop in. So yeah, hopefully you'll be able to see that. So in this session, we're going to be looking at why and how journalism is broken, because I think it clearly is. It's difficult to find any metric on which we're succeeding, so we need to acknowledge that, reflect on why that is, and not just blame everyone else. I'll be introducing you properly to the 7 building blocks of reflective journalism and what I believe should be the overarching aim of journalism, what I call orientation. We'll be looking at how I developed some new forms of real-world journalism that are completely citizen-focused and help us with that aim of orientation. And finally, we'll be looking at what I think the future of journalism could look like, how we can mix principles of collaboration and care for citizens with technological development to create a new journalism that's genuinely fit for the future. And kind of after the 7 building blocks in the middle there, we'll have a little break for some questions there. So, because it's not good, I don't think it's great for any of us if it's just me kind of droning on for 45 minutes or an hour. So we'll have a little break for questions in the middle. So, journalism right now faces a whole bunch of existential problems, but I'm going to focus on 3 key issues today. Firstly, we have a huge and growing problem with trust. The Reuters Institute's Digital News Report last year found that in the UK, just 28% of people say they can trust most news most of the time, and only 39% trust even the news they use. And those figures aren't much better if you look at the global picture either. So we should, I think, be absolutely horrified at that, because if we can't fix that problem, then there really is little point in us doing anything else. Secondly, young people aren't engaging with news that much. And when they do, they're largely not engaging with traditional news brands. So how can we engage young people with reputable sources of news? I talk about young people not because I think they're a different species, I need a different kind of youth news, but simply because they are the audience of the future in demographic terms. And it makes simple common sense to consider how they're engaging with news. And finally, we have a deep and fundamental problem of inclusion that covers gender, disability, neurodivergence, class, sexuality, the whole gamut. But let me put this very clearly, because it's the one I obviously have a deep understanding of. There is racism in our newsrooms, and those racist viewpoints and the supremacy of the white gaze have infected everything about our discourse in society. Put simply, as a thought experiment, if people of colour were driving editorial decisions in newsrooms, then all our discussions about immigration, inequality, education, crime, everything would be entirely different. So we need to recognise that and address it with the very greatest urgency, despite what some people at the Society of Editors might think. And those same principles go for every one of those other identities I mentioned earlier. I'm currently consulting on a couple of other cluster projects looking at building news by and for neurodivergent people and people who've experienced trauma. And in our current media landscape, these aren't even afterthoughts, they're simply not considered. So put together, if you think of all the groups we're talking about here, that is millions of people that newsrooms right now are simply ignoring. And for an industry in crisis, that is just plain weird. So I want to be part of solving some of those existential problems, but I certainly don't have all the answers. What I think I do have is some of the right questions. And I think that's an important point, because part of the reason we've got into this mess is that we haven't been asking enough of the very basic questions about why we do journalism, what it's for, and actually if we're just doing a good enough job of informing citizens. I don't care about journalism for journalism's sake. I care about all this because what we do as journalists is such an important driver of what happens in society. And if we want a better society, we have to build better journalism. So over the last year or so, I've been lucky to have been funded by Cluster here in South Wales to look at how we can do news storytelling better. And I've done that largely by speaking to journalists, sure, but also to game designers, comedians, puppeteers, theatre directors, basically storytellers of all kinds, but also, of course, citizens, mainly, in fact, young people of colour, because their voices and views are so underrepresented in our thinking about journalism currently. So from all those conversations, I synthesised a set of building blocks to consider when we're trying to create that more reflective journalism. And they go something like this. So I'll start with just what the content is. So the basic level is the content we're providing really giving a full and informative picture to our readers and viewers, or genuinely contributing to their understanding of the word? I think often we fail dismally on this really basic question. So for example, when we cover the budget here in the UK, like we did, whatever, 10 days ago, a week ago, the terribly clever interactive content is always along the lines of, you will be £150 a year better off as a result of the budget. So I'm going to be honest and say, well, that is not journalism. What it actually is a political statement that says a low tax, small state government is good for us per se. And better off in that is viewed in such a narrow way and doesn't allow that we want more money spent on health or education, for example. It's just a very kind of, just a simple cash in your pocket focused way of looking at things. And it's just clearly not in step with how we really think about the world. As journalists, I think we kind of often pretend to be objective, but there's nothing objective about that, really. This is a really good example of how the norms, the habits of journalism really unthinkingly drive a very particular view of the world. Similarly, why do we do so much reporting on individual crimes? If it doesn't go beyond prurience or shock value, does it help us understand the world better in any way? Or does it actually help drive a discourse which makes it impossible to have evidence-based discussions about, say, rehabilitation versus punishment? One of the many hats I've worn in my life is I was for some time on the Independent Monitoring Board at Feltham Young Offenders Institute. And it taught me a lot about the drivers of crime and, frankly, the pointlessness of punishment. But the way we habitually cover crime simply doesn't allow that discourse in society. It doesn't allow us to have those discussions in a thoughtful way. Secondly, what my research really brought home to me was how much citizens are crying out for context, and how journalism's inability, frankly, to deal with long-term systemic questions is failing us all. So on the day news, the kind of stuff I did at Sky for 15 years, hugely prioritizes breaking or at least moving events, but really to the detriment of context, analysis, or understanding. So at one level, this makes news largely incomprehensible to most people because we're so focused on the habit of constantly updating the top line. At Sky, I was doing that every hour. So the underlying point or issue quickly becomes really difficult to unpick as a viewer if you're not watching the news every hour or even every day. And at a macro level, journalism deals very badly with enormous changes that happen gradually over time. Can anyone think of something, one of those? It's largely why journalism has dealt so badly with environmental crises, because there is no single day event to cover when it comes to climate change. The Earth isn't putting out press releases, right? When the constant question from editors is, what's the peg for this story? Why should we be doing this now, right? For some bizarre reason, we're all going to die in a ball of flames doesn't seem to be a good enough answer enough of the time because of those sort of systemic habits. Is anyone starting to think now that there's maybe a structural problem with how we do journalism. And on that issue, I want to add one more point here about the kind of ludicrous siloing of journalism specializations. So if you work in a big newsroom, say you may have an economics or a business correspondent, a health correspondent, and if you're lucky, maybe an environment correspondent. So some of us, unfortunately, have been there for the enormous arguments when one of those correspondents inadvertently steps onto the beat of one of the others. I know, because of journalists' egos, we have to keep all those things entirely separate. Now, do any of us seriously think economics, health, and the environment are entirely separate issues? But why then do we pretend, but journalists pretend we are, or they are, to keep our correspondents happy? Do we not think there are bigger issues at stake for society that mean we have to do journalism differently? Agency is the next one. So when I talk about agency, I mean both on the kind of input side and the output side. So we need to offer in our coverage a way for people to feel like they're involved in the world and can make a difference. Otherwise, they're simply not going to engage. I'm sure Martin finds this with politics in particular. News isn't just happening to us as kind of passive victims of the news. We're all citizens of our communities and have our own power. So Vox Pops are, of course, the very worst example of this. And I always think of, you know, on like January the 1st, when rail fares go up, and we always do the story because it's a quiet time and it's sort of important. But it's just to do with a formula that relates to the rate of inflation. So we know what it's going to be, largely. And then we always go and ask people, do you think it's a bad thing that rail fares are going up? And people say, yes, I think it's a bad thing that rail fares are going up. If instead we ask them, perhaps, how do you think rail should be funded? I don't think anyone would come up with a complex system of subcontracting whereby the people who own the rails are different from the people who own the trains, blah, blah, blah. But that is actually what we have. And actually, it's that weird system, although I appreciate lots of it has been nationalized again during the pandemic, that leads to those rail fares going up and the lack of investment and all that. So can't we ask those questions so that citizens have agency and can be the authors of solutions, not just victims of problems? Also on the output side, is there a way that we as citizens can express our agency, our curiosity, our choice in how we read or watch journalism? Even online news now is largely just replicating print online, but there are so many other tools that are available to us. Curiosity, for example, is something we're hardwired for in an evolutionary way, and it's what game designers and theatre professionals, for example, use to drive engagement. So maybe we could be working with that too. Tone is the next one. The voice we use to communicate is horribly old-fashioned and formulaic. Last year's Reuters Digital News Report looked at this too and found that only 16% of people, 16%, thought that the news media uses the right tone. So all I have to say on this is I ran a workshop with a group of young people of colour and watched a BBC News bulletin with them. And it was frankly enormously embarrassing and chastening, but it's something journalists should probably do a lot more of. Because sitting there with 20 young people and seeing how quickly they were turned off by the content and tone was quite something. So we need to find a different way of talking to people, because much of our language is just habits which we've transferred from the newspapers of 50 years ago to an entirely different time or medium, and it doesn't really make any sense. Diversity is the next one. So as I said earlier, innovation in storytelling, I could do like 5 hours about this. It's not just about telling stories differently, It's about telling different stories. And you just don't get that if you don't listen to different perspectives, but also really hear them and reflect them. And again, that goes for gender, race, disability, neurodivergence, sexuality, everything. As an example, something from Wales, but which I think people all over the UK will be able to relate to. Let's just talk about geographic diversity. So I worked in London newsrooms for more than 20 years. I endured 20 plus years of enormous eye rolls in London newsrooms when I brought up a story about or from Wales, a constituent nation of the United Kingdom. But think about, of course I don't care, less than half our national broadcasters have a correspondent based in Wales. And our national newspapers largely just rely on press association copy. They don't even bother. What that says out loud is Wales isn't important. We don't really care about people who live in Wales. But yet, incomprehensibly, those same news organisations still expect people in Wales to trust them, engage with them, buy them. And that is not how relationships work, right? And that's before we even get into deeper systemic issues. And finally here, transparency. This speaks again to that existential problem of trust. We have to be transparent and we need to be clear about what we're reporting, how we're getting the information, and we need to acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge where they exist. Sometimes we have to say, we don't know, rather than say something we don't know. If we don't, then people start to fill in the gaps and they see conspiracy where there isn't. And that's how we get into the big old mess we are right now, frankly. Now, the more eagle-eyed among you, probably the sub-editors, will have noticed that that's only 6 building blocks and I promised 7. So that 7 is the overarching principle of narrative and the way we tell our stories. Now, the way I come at this is from kind of fundamental principles of anthropology and neuroscience, because we are deeply, fundamentally, and universally hardwired for stories on an evolutionary level. Across cultures, they're kind of used as virtual reality simulators for life, right? They teach us how to navigate the world, prepare us for difficulties, and ultimately teach us about how we might live more fulfilling lives. And isn't that, at some level, what journalism should be about too? I hope so. So Jonathan Gottschall, in his brilliant book, which I hugely recommend, The Storytelling Animal, puts it beautifully, I think, when he says, we are, as a species, addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. But our dreams aren't written in inverted pyramid style. So why are our news stories? Why are they backwards? So the rather prosaic reason for that is the Telegraph, the original newswire, because it was expensive and unreliable, so it made sense to put as much information as possible at the beginning, just in case you lost the end of it. And we don't use the Telegraph anymore, that's gone. But the habits formed by that technology are still defining much of journalism. And given that our communications technology has completely transformed several times since the Telegraph, it's sort of weird that journalism hasn't. So as part of my research, I had the pleasure of talking to Jonathan on a couple of occasions. And what those conversations really reinforced for me was if we want our news stories to connect and engage our audiences, we sort of have to engage that natural yearning for stories that's just a fundamental part of us. And what that largely means, and the results of our testing proved it, which I'll show you in a bit, was writing in a linear rather than an inverted style. So to sum all that up, I came up with an overall aim that journalism should be about what I call orientation. So by that, I mean that consuming news should help us understand the world, locate us in our environment, and help us understand and meaningfully interact with it. Ultimately, it should help us form a view which is consistent with our own personal and community interests and needs. Now that sounds obvious, but when you look at the journalism that actually exists in the world, very little of it actually helps us achieve that aim. So, just for the pragmatic reason that I'm not entirely sure anyone wants to hear me drone on for a full hour, I thought it'd be useful to drop in a bit of time just now to answer a few initial questions about what we've talked about so far. So yeah, do feel free to kind of drop in. I think Natasha's going to deal with those if we have any.
If people either want to put a question in the chat box or indicate, and we do have some questions that were sent in advance as well, so I can always start with those. But yeah, thank you for that first part, Shirish. That was covering a lot of really fascinating topics and just showing a really different viewpoint of journalism. I'm especially interested in diversity, and we had questions that were sent in advance in relation to that. You touched on well, inclusion and neurodiversity, for example, as well as other characteristics that people think about when we talk about inclusion. And the question was in relation to how do we find ways of supporting more diverse people into journalism so that they are the ones telling the stories, their voice being heard. And then,
yeah, so I think there's lots of kind of answers to that. I think what I'd say is, I think there's a lot of focus. So for instance, we talk about race, there's lots of focus. The answer is always a diversity internship or something like that. And I think that's problematic for many reasons, because I think there's actually a pipeline problem which comes a long time before that. So actually people don't see journalism as a career they want to get into from a long time before that, or don't see it because of the structures we have now, don't see it as a career that's open to them or possible for them. And I think we should be working perhaps at, kind of 12, 13 to actually work with schools, pupils and parents actually to kind of to work better at showing that it is kind of a career that's worthwhile, it's valuable, it's open to people, and actually that we can put things in place to make it more open. To do that, of course, we have to put those things in place. And I think we're a long way from doing that. But as I say, that's why I'm kind of working with Cluster and others to work on things that are designed better for people who are neurodivergent, for example, and speak to their different ways of engaging with news stories, for example. And a little bit of that is around those kind of narratives that actually, like many people remember this, like I spent my first term at Cardiff Journalism School, as it was then, just being shouted at because I couldn't get how to write in that inverted pyramid style because it's weird, right? And it's one of those things that journalists then regard, oh, it's character building, therefore everyone has to do it. It's like being in the army or whatever. But actually, if it's weird, even if you're coming at this from a kind of normative approach, then isn't it going to be even weirder and more difficult if you're not? And actually linear stories, are just kind of, they're much more natural to most people. And actually, funnily enough, we have all this hand-wringing about, oh, well, people only read our stories for 10 seconds, as if that's a surprise. Well, of course they do, because you've put all the key information in the first 10 seconds. And actually that's kind of militating against understanding, because really you want people to read the full context and background, for example.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat box. So we've got one from David Nicholson. David, would you like to ask the question yourself, or shall I read it for you?
Yeah, I can ask it. I mean, you went to Oxford and you met people who own media companies, and isn't that one of the key issues why press and TV companies aren't motivated to change the world? They want to keep it as it is, owned by people like them. So their owners' motivation is not to have people asking questions like, why did test and trace, which was completely unsuccessful, cost way more than a pay rise for NHS staff? That's not a question you normally would have answered in the newspapers that we read or on the news stories, but it's precisely what the owners want, isn't it? So it's ownership, really. That's the issue, surely.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, you're exactly right. There's no motivation for anyone, for the owners particularly, to change that. Is what I call, that vision of the world as conservative with a small c. It's just, that stuff about the budget, for example, is just kind of replicating the dominant narrative as if it's objective when clearly it isn't. But I think there's also a power thing in newsrooms. If you're, a white male middle class 55-year-old Oxbridge graduate who runs a newsroom, actually the way I'm thinking about how we should tell stories sort of de-skills you, because you don't know how to do that really. You don't know any people of colour, or you don't know, you don't see those different stories, and you're not really interested in them. And actually, if you gave up any power, then actually it massively disempowers you, because you don't have those skills. That thing I talk about, even being kind of character building, jokingly, about learning how to do journalism in a particular way. So there's no incentive to give up any of that or even share power. So if I'm honest, my views have really hardened on this in the last sort of 6 months to a year, when I've been doing a lot of this kind of work and kind of butting up against these structures. Is I'm increasingly don't think we can change the structures in currently existing institutions, because it's what I call kind of a lava lamp. So sorry, where I rose quite quickly when I was a young journalist. I was editing network news programs when I was 25 years old. But then there's a stop, because people don't really want you to have any more power than that. So you get kind of marginalized and pushed down again. No one gets above that level where you can have actual power. So it's not just a question of time. The gatekeepers are always going to be having that small c conservative worldview. So I increasingly think we have to build our own new institutions which do this kind of work, frankly. And it's simultaneously depressing and exciting at the same time, if you see what I mean. That actually, I wish we could change the BBC or ITV News or whatever, but I'm not sure we can. And talking about, even geographic diversity, I call it in TV news, the Ealing problem, that television news is disproportionately made by people who live in Ealing. So it's made by the people of Ealing for the people of Ealing, and then just not interested in anything beyond that kind of worldview. And I think as journalists, our job is absolutely to look beyond our direct experience, right? That's the whole point, to reflect the experiences of other people. But I think people, in traditional news organisers just aren't that interested for all those reasons we just discussed.
Thank you, Shirish. There is another question in relation to the BBC, and I know that Simon Cottle has his hand up too, so I see that. We have a question from Lila, which I'll come to first. Lila, would you like me to read it for you? Or you go for it?
I'm not quite sure that it's an appropriate time to ask the question, but I'll try anyway. Last night on Newsnight, Emma Dabbery, appearing as a guest, outlined concisely how racism as an overriding global concept was founded by the English in the 1660s. Initially, I felt I learned a lot in a few seconds, which I did, but afterwards I wondered, what proportion of listeners would have failed to grasp the central facts or even to take anything from it. So I was wondering if you think my view is well founded in these days of a certain kind of approach and presentation. And if I am right, is it because we're just not used to that kind of fact-filled contribution? And how would you suggest doing it more effectively? A lot in there, I know, sorry.
No. So I think, yes, it's an appropriate question. It's a very good question. And luckily, I'm going to cover that in the second half of the presentation, because I'm going to be looking at, the kind of work I've done to actually come up with alternative ways of thinking about how we do news. And actually, we tested those ways on almost 1,300 people and had some really fascinating results. So we will come to that.
Thanks.
Thank you. We've got, well, Simon Cottle is putting his hand up to ask a question. So would you like to come in, Simon?
Yep, thank you very much. And thank you, Shirish, for some really interesting and thought-provoking points. I just wanted to, if I may, firstly, broaden the debate possibly, and you're starting to touch on this now in your last comments, but then also to add possibly a couple of ideas which relate to your 7 building blocks of reflective journalism. So firstly, anything that's reflective around journalism, it seems to me, also has to reflect on the structures, as you were starting to do now, of ownership and management and control, which kind of begs really a political economy analysis about, you know, markets and ownership and all that really hard stuff which shapes and constrains and controls what journalists do, whether we are conscious of it or not. And when we start to think about that complexity, it tends to qualify, unfortunately, I would say, the hope in what is a social compositional argument. I think you were indicating that if more people of colour, for example, were in newsrooms, the news would be very, very different. I'd like to think it would be, but I think some of the surrounding prevailing constraints and pressures actually point to a much more complex and deep-seated issue than simply getting the right people in the right jobs. We're all constrained by our environments, and people of colour are as well, I think. So that's the first point. The second point is that I was wondering if you would like to think a little bit about the changing nature of the global media ecology, which is so much more complicated now, isn't it, than it used to be even a few years ago, in terms of how media and communications are interacting, you know, bottom down, top up, horizontally. Social media's in the mix, mainstream media are on the internet. It's a very complex ecology, which is full of opportunities, I think, but also full of major obstacles as well, I think, new obstacles, which might also, I think, just qualify that the hope in the 7 building blocks that you were suggesting. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm all for more reflective journalism and reflecting on it. So that's my first 2 points about the kind of bigger picture. In terms of the reflective building blocks, I was just wondering, isn't there something to be said about, to use that horrible term, epistemology, about the ways in which we know something, so the different types of storytelling and what that should entail? And I bet you've thought about this a lot, and probably more than me. So I'd love to hear something about that, you know, in terms of about how stories become alive through experiential encounters, not just simply analysis. Although there, in terms of agency, we want to have the analysis from ordinary voices and the experiences from the kind of elite voices that you know, we want to invert that kind of priority, I think. And lastly, we live in global times, and part of the problem of journalism, I think, which might suggest that journalism is part of the problem and not the solution sometimes, to put it bluntly, is that journalism operates in a world of methodological nationalism. That in a time where a world is in crisis, climate change you've mentioned, but biodiversity loss, the 6.6 mass extinction, a whole range of other issues, including zoonotic pandemics, which journalism has woefully failed to report on as a a relationship broken with nature. You're talking about the relationship with journalism being broken. Human society is breaking the relationship with nature, and journalism isn't really stepping up to that at all, I don't think. So how on earth are we going to get journalism and journalists to step outside of their nationalistic boxes and see this as a global phenomenon, and not simply seeing it at the sharp end as they would prefer to see it, of, you know, their own citizens or their own locality. We need that bigger picture.
Yeah.
And that has to be part of reflective journalism, it seems to me.
Thank you, Simon. That's a number of really good points and questions that you've raised there. We do have some more questions coming through. But I'll hand back over to Shirish.
Yeah, shall I just answer those Simon's points then, and then maybe we can come back to the others kind of afterwards, if I to kind of do, because I think some of them are going to speak to the kind of stuff I'm going to describe next, and then we'll make sure to come back to those other ones. So if I've got Simon's points right, so I think I agree broadly with all of those. So on the sort of systemic things, I think, yeah, as I was saying to David, I think you're exactly right. Just having people of colour in the organisation is not enough, because, you know, frankly, if they're the people that succeed in the organisations the way they are, even if they're people of colour or, you know, are coming from any different background, or, you know, women even, that they're fitting into that system. That's how they get to kind of to progress in the system the way it is. You don't progress by starting out and trying to kind of upturn the model. So yes, and that's why I'm increasingly coming around to what I mentioned to David, that I don't think we can necessarily do it within the institutions which exist, and maybe we have to build something entirely different. On the kind of bigger kind of ecology stuff, yeah, it's complicated. I don't think that's my area of expertise, if I'm honest, but well, I think there is hope. Well, I suppose what I'd say is, look, journalism is failing on pretty much every metric. So, you know, if only 28% of people trust any of the news, then there's you know, 72% of people who want something different, arguably. So that to me is a market, right? You know, we're not going to engage all of those 70, but actually there is a market out there which we're just not catering to because of the way we do news. And so there may be, and that's a really kind of big picture, kind of vague statement, but I think maybe that's where the market is. But like, the economics aren't necessarily my area of expertise. There are much better qualified people on that. On the kind of epistemology, yes, absolutely. On the big picture, well, on the kind of radical side, we're really interested, for example, at Bureau Local, in doing work with theatre makers to tell stories. In fact, we did a thing called Refuge Woman, which came out of some of our work on homelessness, where Cash Carraway, an author you may have heard of, actually did a one-woman show which we co-produced, which went across the UK, talking about her experience. And we're working on a nascent theatre production right now, but we're also looking at comedy, other ways of doing that. But I'll also talk about just other different ways of storytelling, which we used just in that kind of online news world in the second half. And on the nationalism stuff, again, 100% agree with you. A really good example, actually, is I was doing a talk about kind of the way we report economics with some students. And I was saying, so this is only a couple of weeks ago, you probably remember the headlines, which were like, you know, growth is down 10% over the last year, and that's the worst it's ever been, right? And so then the story is, then this is all terrible, right? And it's not great. But I said to the students, given that we've been in the middle of a pandemic and everything was shut, is 10% better or worse than you would have thought? And then they were like, oh yeah, it's like better than I would have thought. That's a different, you know, that's a different way of looking at it. But what the key point of that is almost, what is the point of comparing 2020 with 2015 or even 1975? the 0 point, because a pandemic is hopefully a once in a lifetime situation. What's actually a better comparison there is if you were to compare the UK with France or Germany or Japan, you know, comparable economies. But we habitually do not do that for exactly the reasons you described. But that actually is a comparison that better helps me understand how the UK economy has fared comparably in the same circumstance. But as you say, we're just focused on this is the worst it's ever been in the UK. Well, obviously, frankly, the comparison with other years in the UK is empty. And actually, we do need to think in those more global ways. And as you say, particularly about environment. And as I say, that speaks to that kind of siloization as well. You know, like I say, do we seriously think economics, health, and the environment are separate topics? Of course not. You know, so hopefully that's answered some of those questions. Yeah, from my perspective anyway. Shall we crack on, Natasha, and then come back? Is that all right?
That's great. Thank you very much.
Cool. It's just given everyone a bit of a break, hopefully. So thank you. But yeah, they were great questions. So I'll pop back into sharing mode. There we go. So can move it on. Oh yeah, so right, I'll leave them there for the moment. So as kind of discussed, talk is cheap, really, and it's lovely to have all those interesting conversations and have big thoughts over coffee and whatever, but it means nothing if you're not making practical change. So I built a whole bunch of prototypes which incorporated some or all of those 7 building blocks, and then we tested the most interesting of them on what ended up being more than 1,200 people. So we've got really robust and useful results. So I'll probably help to show you in a second, in screenshot form at least, a couple of those prototypes. But what I'd say before I do that is that people get massively hung up on the format and think that's the innovation, the kind of shiny thing. But shiny things aren't the answer. What we're actually trying to change and test here is a change to the underlying journalism and rethinking that. Because until we do that, none of the other many and various discussions about journalism strategy are worth having. Unless we fix the journalism, every other conversation about so-called innovation is empty. So all these prototypes were about the same story, the proposed HS2 high-speed rail line. And you can see probably that we branded them as BBC stories, so we could basically remove the brand variable when we were testing them with users. So to start with, I simply asked myself, as a citizen, what do I need to know? Remember, journalists are people too. So sometimes we just have to step outside of our habitual kind of ways of thinking and think, what am I doing here? What fundamentally is useful information for this story? So we call this prototype the narrative accordion, because at root, it's a linear narrative, but it's split up into questions and answers, which you can read either from top to bottom or in the order you want. It's linear, gives the user a sense of agency, a chance to express their curiosity in the way it takes them, but actually provides a lot of really useful information. One other thing you may notice, sorry,
can
Martin.
we're not seeing your screen at the moment.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, I didn't press the share button. There you go.
Now we can, thank you.
Yeah. I'll play that again for you just so you can see. Sorry, there you go. So yeah, so this is narrative recording. You see the questions and answers opening up, and yeah, the questions are sort of the interesting bit. The questions I asked that I feel we need to answer as a citizen. So another thing you may notice, sorry, Martin, is that there are none of the standard quotes from politicians. That is largely because we normally regard this as a sort of political story, but actually you do not need them. They do not help us to understand the story better and actually are often confusing. Going back to the Reuters Institute report from last year, people believed that by far the greatest source of disinformation was domestic politicians. And if we don't need them, Why are we bothering? Why insert that risk to trust? Why don't we just stick to the facts? We kind of know what the politicians are going to say about those things, a lot of these issues. Not every issue. I'm not saying we take all politicians out of news, but actually things which we traditionally think of as a politics story, which we have to have political reaction in, I don't think we always do. And it's interesting to think about that, because as I say, it inserts what people regard as untrustworthy comment. So the next prototype, I'm only going to show you a couple of these, the most interesting to me. So this is what we call the contextual timeline. So in this one, we addressed directly the need for greater context, more focus on the broad sweep of the story, and a deprioritization of the breaking aspect of a complex story. So timelines aren't new, but I think what's interesting here is the scope of our timeline. It starts with the introduction of Japanese high-speed rail. So going back almost 60 years here, because a big aspect of the HS2 story is how terrible the UK is at high-speed rail. This isn't some brand new invention. And then we actually look into the future to give a broad outline of what's likely to happen next with the story. Now, some people will say this isn't strictly news, but if we go back to the principle of orientation, I think actually having some sense of a future timeline is really, really important, because this highlights that even if things go smoothly, which they clearly won't, HS2 won't be finished for another 20 years. And actually, when I was doing the work on this, it brought up some really interesting stuff for me, because I wanted to do stuff differently. I didn't rely on other news articles to do the research. I went back to the source material. For example, the Oakervie review, which was the review on which Boris Johnson made the final decision on whether to go ahead with HS2. So, for example, a lot of the justification for HS2 is built around this, I'm using quotes here, levelling up agenda, right? You might be interested to know that there has been no economic modelling of the impact of HS2 on levelling up. Zero economic modelling, right? I think that's important to know. But because as journalists, we often just rely on the previous article for our research, we're just doing a kind of iteration of the previous article, that very few people actually went to the source material of the Oakervie review to find out things like that. Really interesting stuff, like between London and Birmingham, there'll only be 8 minutes on HS2 when you'll have a view, because everything else is in tunnels or surrounded by noise deadening barriers. I think those are sort of interesting things to know when we're thinking about this stuff. But I was just really struck by how I'd never seen any of this stuff, particularly the kind of economic modelling stuff, in any journalism I'd read about it. And I think that's also important, going back to the source material and not just doing kind of, I suppose, that the journalism we kind of normally do. And, you know, I'm not kind of, I've done it myself, for 25 years. So the results, as I say, were really interesting. So we first looked at the idea of what I call knowledge transfer, just a really core aim of journalism. How much information did readers pick up from reading the story? How confident did they feel about the subject after reading it? So what was really striking was how well the narrative accordion did, miles ahead of the other articles. It did particularly well with everyone under 35, with the knowledge transfer being around a third higher than the comparable BBC News story, but in half the time. So in fact, the BBC article was just twice as long, but provided less information. That's clearly a really important result if we're interested at all in younger audiences, but it's actually true for all audiences. It's a universal solution, which I love. Getting more knowledge in less time in a format that they like has to be a huge win. When we asked how interesting or enjoyable the articles were and what users thought of the language, layout, tone, format, and navigation, our prototypes did really well. The original BBC article came in the bottom 2 on all of those. And that's really important, because if people don't find articles enjoyable or interesting, then they're simply not going to come to your website in the first place. And none of this is dunk on the BBC. We're just really using it as a proxy for all standard journalism in this space, because it largely all follows the kind of same patterns and structures. On the other hand, the narrative accordion did really well, coming top in most of those categories and in the top 2 in all of them. We then asked users if, comparing against what's currently available to them here in the UK, they found the prototypes more engaging, more informative, more interesting, more relatable, more useful, or more kind of user-friendly. And we then calculated what I call a net approval rating. So taking away the negative reactions from the positive reactions, like they do with the kind of politicians' net approval ratings. So if you have a look at these results, they are big numbers, right? Because these are net approval ratings. So overall, the narrative accordion, the prototype we looked at a bit earlier, with the expandable and collapsible questions, that's the most consistently good with really solid approval ratings. The contextual timeline does pretty well, but it's actually designed for a very specific question, really, which we're not asking here. But look at the results for engaging with what I call the plain text dramatic prototype. That was a version I wrote, which was just a linear narrative, albeit attempting quite badly, I think, to cast it in a sort of 3-act dramatic structure. So that is the biggest number by far. I genuinely think that is just people enjoying a straightforward linear structure which starts at the beginning and ends at the end. You could all just implement that in your newsrooms or wherever tomorrow at no cost and be engaging vastly more people, right? So that's, to me, fascinating. And they all do well on being informative and useful, which is, of course, the bedrock of journalism, we hope. But that actually means very little, if we're honest, if people don't enjoy it and they're not engaged with the work. And what we've done here is shown that all of that is possible. And finally, with a contextual timeline and the narrative accordion, which we looked at earlier, we asked respondents if the layout and navigation made their experience more convenient, more engaging, or helped them understand the story better than the other options kind of currently available to them. On both of those measures, both these formats did very well. So they broadly mirrored each other. But if we just look at the narrative accordion here, 83% of people said it made it more convenient. 79% said it made the experience more engaging. And 75% said it helped them understand the story better. We should all take a moment to breathe that in, I think, because that doesn't take investment, doesn't take any more resource. In fact, most of those stories were only half as long as the BBC story they're based on. And because they're not in inverted pyramid structure, they're actually really easy to write. It took me like 20 minutes to write those. So frankly, doing stories this way is much easier to do, but still achieves far greater engagement, better, faster knowledge transfer than the kind of news that's currently available. So it's more and better what all publishers want. So for me, it's a no-brainer. And the only thing that's holding us back is that intrinsic conservatism of this industry. So the future, building on that, I also want to talk about what the future of storytelling and indeed journalism looks like for me. And for me, that's a really user-focused journalism we've been talking about, built with community in mind, but also using technology to drive what we do to make it hopefully bigger and better. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I work in the Bureau local team at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and I work there part-time as a community organiser. So my whole job is essentially to facilitate a community who mostly aren't journalists to what we call carry out acts of journalism, as we describe it. So on that theme, just a very quick question, although it's a really important one, is, why do we think readers or viewers engage with our work? What is it that drives them to connect with us? And I'm going to pop up a slide here, which comes from Hearken, an organisation in the US that some of you may have heard of. They focus on community engagement tools. And they say the key motivators are vulnerability or pain. So that's the desire to have an immediate need met. Curiosity, a desire to learn. We've talked about that a bit. Connection, a desire to belong. Serving others, which we massively underestimate, how much people just want to help other people. And again, in that kind of small c, kind of neoliberal way, I think we massively underestimate that. And storytelling, a desire to be heard or hear the tales of lived experience of others. So, as we talked about, a lot of how we think in our industry is focused on journalism and journalists' needs. For example, when we talk about how we get users to pay for content, that conversation is often around what sort of person would pay for journalism? Who do we need to target? And I think we should be starting the other way around. Why should they pay for journalism? What are we offering that they would want? That is how other people who make products think. And journalists kind of think different rules apply to us because it's public service or whatever. Yeah, but we have to actually have to provide the public service. We don't just get a free pass. So essentially what we've got on this slide are basically essential human needs that we should be thinking about fulfilling. So we need to think better how to fulfill some of those basic human needs. And why? Well, it's trust. That's the biggest problem facing journalism, and deep engagement is the answer to that. People talk forever in articles and seminars like this about building long-term relationships with communities and investing to build trust over time. And you know what? Nobody ever does it. So we can carry on not doing that until our industry dies because nobody believes a word we say, and then we'll wish we had done it, and it will be too late. So kind of secondly, you may think that lots of the stuff around community that I've been talking about is very kind of touchy-feely, yoga pants, namaste stuff, but I'm also very hard-nosed about the future. Apologies if you can see my tweet notifications there. Let's not beat around the bush here. AI, machine learning, and natural language generation can already write many, many stories more quickly and more accurately than us humans. So I actually welcome that because lots of the journalism we do is really boring and time consuming. And we can actually do different things while the AI is doing those basic stories. So what is the future for journalism and journalists? Well, AI will get very, very good at writing stories very soon. But what are computers not very good at? Engagement and deep connection. So Chelsea Herring from Hearken puts it beautifully for me when she says, humans still win at the game of intimacy, care, and mutual support, and we will for a long time to come. Those are our killer app. They're our USP. So let's start in that horrible terminology, leveraging that. So that really is my vision for the future of journalism. And by coincidence, kind of what my next cluster research project is going to be looking at. Journalists providing the human qualities, connection and engagement, working alongside AI, machine learning and natural language generation to produce better, richer, more connected journalism. And that journalism, even though it might be automated, should build on the organic storytelling structures that we've built over 3,000 years to create more useful, informative, personalized, fact-based content that gives citizens what they want and need. So that's just one vision, and you can agree or disagree with it, of course. But I think we can agree that what we're doing right now isn't working. So we can't just sit here whining about it and then go and do exactly the same thing we always have. We do need to try something different. And so talking of that, I wanted to finish up with some words from the heart, really, about how our industry creates and sustains racism. So some of you know that last year I ran an event for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which we called Decolonizing the News, Confronting Journalism's Role in Systemic Racism. So we had more than 500 people come, and it started some really valuable conversations around the world. But I don't really want to have any conversations anymore. I'm really tired of it, and today has been particularly tiring for that. So to come back to my story, I essentially left journalism 7 years ago, because I couldn't pay the emotional price anymore. I'd fought for so long to bring different perspectives, tell different stories, reflect the world better and more inclusively. But all that time, I was being gaslit by the organisation and the industry. I'd endured so many of those eye rolls, so many dismissals of my thoughts and feelings, so little acknowledgement of my achievements whilst other people were being championed and promoted, that I'd started to believe that I couldn't do journalism, that I was just no good at it. And that's not just my story. That's the story of pretty much anyone who actually brings the diversity of views that newsroom leaders say they want in public, but very few actually want to hear. So for instance, when people talk dismissively and in a completely othering way about immigrants, how do you think that makes me feel? Our discourse dehumanizes and caricatures immigrants as opportunistic and undeserving. I vividly remember my parents when we lived in a very rural part of Pembrokeshire, where we've had some of this stuff quite recently, at the weekend, on top of their other jobs, making curries in a ludicrously big pan that covered our whole cooker, and then driving around the local pubs, delivering those curries in little foil tins for the pubs to sell. Because we lived in poverty, frankly. So do we really think they and the millions of people like them were opportunistic and undeserving? I don't. So imagine how that kind of newsroom conversation about immigrants makes me and many, many others feel. And look, the big problem with our industry is that we use notions of objectivity as our defense against almost every criticism, but it's absolute nonsense. Our so-called news values aren't a collection of objective truths. They're a system of entirely subjective beliefs which are shaped by the dominant groups in our newsrooms. Let's call them, just for the sake of argument, white, metropolitan, middle-aged men. As we talked about earlier, these beliefs are just grounded in fundamentally conservative with a small c view of the world. And of course they are, as we talk about. As Rasmus Kleist-Nielsen, who's the director of the Reuters Institute, puts it, newsrooms contain vanguards and rearguards. The rearguard thinks the problem is that the world has changed too much, that they're being cancelled now. The vanguard thinks the problem is that journalism hasn't changed enough. But right now, the rearguards are the people who hold all the power and can, if they want, gaslight and force out the vanguards and those different understandings of the world which put their status and power at risk. So that's why the reflective response of almost every newsroom to the diversity problem, because it's a problem, is to set up another internship. And that suits the status quo perfectly, because it means newsrooms don't have to give up or share any actual power or really change anything they do. At the same time, journalists of colour who already work in that newsroom are leaving in their droves because it's not a place they feel comfortable where they can pay the emotional cost anymore. And that goes for, not just race, of course. So we need to start by treating diversity as more than just a PR problem. And what I'm concerned about right now is the reaction of many newsrooms to Black Lives Matter and the other conversations it sparked is to respond in that entirely superficial, comms-driven way. We better do some stuff that foregrounds people of colour or we'll look bad. That is not it. We have to get hold of the fact that this is a matter of fundamental equality. And that also means we can't create some bizarre hierarchy of diversity. So what we get right now for a few months is people of colour being foregrounded because we're a PR priority, whilst in the meantime, people with disabilities or from a different class or geographical background get pushed even further to the back of the queue. That is not what real diversity or real inclusion look like, right? So I had to go freelance to do investigations, do research, win awards, and finally be seen and heard. But not everyone in my position has that opportunity. When you're effectively gaslit by the industry throughout your career, it's easy to lose confidence and maybe start believing that they're right. You're not a good journalist and your ideas really don't fit. So what I really hope that people in this session might do following this is really look around your organizations, the people working with you, and check, am I really seeing and hearing you? And look to at the people who've left your organization and ask yourself honestly why that was. Was the emotional cost too much? And if so, what does that say about your organization? So ultimately, I think this whole seminar has been about asking ourselves fundamental questions about the purpose of journalism, to find a way of building a better future. And part of that, getting to that point, has to be about fixing our industry in every way. So we have the power to do it in our hands right now, but we have to have the will. And I really hope we can build that will together. So thank you so much for listening. It's been a real privilege, and of course, happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. That's been a really fascinating insight into the work that you've been doing, but also for taking us on sort of a journey with you in terms of your personal experiences and the experiences that you've seen, and how that's affected other people in journalism. And also, you know, the message to this group here as well, because there will be, I know there are students here, there are people from different backgrounds here who will be kind of having that same crisis of confidence perhaps, and wondering, okay, where do I go in this industry and how can I follow the path that I want to? So thank you very much for that. It actually links a little bit to a couple of questions that we had earlier. So one from Angela, and she was asking about the journalist's inner life and conception of him or herself and the practice of reflection and how you can identify the blind spots through that. And then another question that came from Patricia, which was about tone and also, you know, where is the truth in the storytelling? So we have 3 minutes, but by all means, give it your best shot. We can't hear you at the moment.
He doesn't realize he's on mute.
Are you on mute? Oh, sorry, there you are.
Sorry. I deliberately muted myself to kind of have a drink and then, sorry. So yeah, I'm just kind of starting to look back at the questions. Yeah, on the tone, I did see that earlier. Yeah, you're right. It's really difficult to isolate and there's no model for the tone, right? But what I found was just writing essentially simply, straightforwardly, not using journalese, all the things actually we get told at journalism school. And then we sort of do the opposite because then we come into an organization where people are using those old-fashioned habits. So it's not, again, and I say, it's not about kind of doing youth news and trying to kind of talk in the way young people talk, but it's just simply, straightforwardly. And on the kind of truth, yeah, it's where I go, why I'm really committed to just keeping it fact-based and going back to the source material, for example, and not, where we can, keeping out politicians, because that's not fact-based, right? It's, you know, whatever party we, you know, follow or agree with or whatever, it's all ideological. We understand that, you know, it's not coming from a position of neutrality where, you know, there's a kind of rational decision-making process. It all comes from an ideology. And so where we can, for the, you know, because I'm going back to that stuff of people's hinterlands are different. People don't necessarily understand that newspapers have a political slant. They really don't. So actually, if in our journalism, we can make things kind of more fact-based and less kind of that habitual, Labour said this, Lib Dem said that, Conservatives said that, then actually that makes a big difference.
Thank you. There's some very, very positive comments in the chat box around the presentations. There were a few other questions, but I'm conscious that we're running to the end of the session. So I was going to hand back over to Martin just to sum up at the end. But anyone who would like to get in touch, please do so. We'll put some contact details into the chat box. And you're also very welcome to get in touch with us at the NUJ as well, if you'd like to know any more about the union or any follow-up events that you think you'd be interested in us organising. So I'll hand back over to Martin. You need to unmute yourself, Martin.
Right, okay. Right, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Well, thank you very much, Natasha, but thank you particularly to Shirish for this absolutely tremendous presentation, which has been extremely thought-provoking and inspiring, and I'm sure that a lot of us have got a great deal out of it. And it is absolutely imperative that we don't just carry on doing the same old stuff over and over again without reflecting on what we are doing. And you quite rightly say that you know, there are huge challenges which are facing journalism, particularly this issue of trust, and how do we overcome this concern that people have. I mean, one thing that I was going to put forward there in a question to you, which you know, I will allow this to happen myself because I've asked a question, but I would like to hear what you have to say to this, Shirish. And this comes from, you know, a lot of experience that I've had, which is that private sector news websites without paywalls have as a business model they're based on getting programmatic advertising revenue, and they rely on maximizing page views. This is leading to trivialization and sensationalism, the opposite of the kind of reflective, contextualized journalism that you are advocating. I see this as a major problem for the future, and what are your observations?
So I'd say something very quickly on that, and I totally accept that that is a problem. But what's been particularly interesting, particularly in the pandemic, is that the pages and the stories which have done really, really well have been ones which give basic information about things like what the restrictions in Wales right now, or yeah, when can I do this or when can I do that. So actually, people are looking for facts and information that help them live their lives. And actually, maybe we're kind of, maybe that kind of programmatic advertising model, in the way it's seen by journalists, is actually underestimating the readership in a way. Because actually, I think we've seen really clear examples of this during the pandemic. What I'd also say on that is that people were crowing from news organizations at the beginning of the pandemic saying, oh yeah, our readership or our viewership has gone up by 25% since the beginning of the pandemic. We're amazing. Everything we do is brilliant, right? What they didn't talk about so much was how they actually went down to below pre-pandemic levels after a couple of months. And I regard those initial page views as in a way like a 999 call, a call for help. We want journalism to provide a service here. And actually, quite often they were disappointed. And I think we need to think in that way a lot more. What is the service we can provide here?
I agree with you entirely, Shirish. So look, thank you very much once again. I know that everyone who has been here is extremely grateful to you for coming along. I think that the format that we've had this evening has been very good because there's been quite a lot of interaction, and I think it provides us with a template for hopefully many future events that we can all learn from. So look, thank you so much for coming along. Very grateful to you indeed, and thanks everyone for coming along as well, and for your contributions and for listening. Okay, all the best to you. And for those of us who are members of the NUJ, in Cardiff, the next branch meeting will be the second Tuesday in April, which won't be as exciting as this one. But thank you all very much indeed, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. Okay, cheers. Hmm. Hmm.
Do you want to stop the recording, Natasha?
I've passed the host back to you, Rachel, so you should be able to stop the recording.
Oh, thank you.
Verdict?